Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of February of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. This morning promised us a lot of adventures. As you know, the President of the United States of America, Joe Biden, visited Kiev this morning, and as a result of his visit, he promised another help, another support for around $500 million, and he promised to support Ukraine in the future. First of all, when talking about the Russian experts, Russian media, a lot of experts didn't believe the Ukrainians that Joe Biden was going to visit Ukraine. But later, when we saw the first pictures of the President of the United States of America, most of the Russian experts were saying that before Biden visited Ukraine, the administration of the President of the United States of America asked permission to enter Ukraine, and they required for some kind of obligations that the Russians were not going to attack the territory of Ukraine with missiles during the day. So they're trying to show this situation in the Russian favor. Let's say like the President of the United States of America, before visiting Ukraine, was asked the Russians permission to enter Ukraine. Of course, we can talk a lot about this situation, but anyway, we can compare this visit, the visit of the President of the United States, with the visit of Nancy Pelosi, the island by the name of Taiwan, or something like this. And there are a lot of common things and the most important difference, but there are a lot of differences. And the most important difference between these two visits, between the visit of Nancy Pelosi and Biden, is that when talking about the visit of Nancy Pelosi, that visit was completely opened. Everybody knew about that visit, and the administration of Nancy Pelosi started preparation of that visit for many days before she visited that island. But when talking about Ukraine, we see that Joe Biden was trying to hide, and the administration of President of the United States of America was trying to hide this visit. And to tell the truth, this is very interesting because from this perspective, I believe that the visit of Nancy Pelosi was more powerful, that she warned about upcoming visit for many days ago. She didn't try to hide, she didn't try to play the games, or furthermore, she didn't ask any permission of Chinese to enter this island. But when talking about Ukraine, as you can see, the Russians are saying that administration of Joe Biden asked permission to enter Ukraine. I'm not sure that this piece of information is correct. Maybe this is some kind of speculation, or maybe this is another attempt of the Russians to make the situation in their favor. I don't know. But anyway, we see what we see and we have what we have. But when talking about the Russians, they also gave us a lot of surprises this morning. And before announced visit of Joe Biden, this morning we received a very interesting piece of information from, let's say, Kursk, Belgorod region. As you can see, there is an icon in this area that shows that if you are able to translate this icon says that the Russians crossed the border. As you can see, this is the north of Kupiansk front line. For now, there are no more updates about the situation, whether that information was true or not. Maybe that was some kind of game, and the Russians, maybe they were trying to break and to ruin and to break this visit, not to give the opportunity for Joe Biden to enter Ukraine. Maybe they wanted to make some kind of illusion of offensive operation and to force Joe Biden to change his plan. I don't know. But anyway, today the Russians this morning published information that they crossed the border. I'm not sure that this icon was put correctly. Maybe the Russians crossed the border somewhere else, but it's just to understand the situation. Furthermore, when talking about the south, about Zaporozhye area, the Russians also published information that they started some kind of Reko offensive operation in direction of Novodanilovka, in direction of Varekhov. They reported that there were heavy clashes in the vicinity of Novodanilovka, but by this evening, we still haven't received any confirmation or any reports about the reality of these clashes. Maybe that was also some kind of game and some kind of speculation just to force Joe Biden not to enter Ukraine. Maybe the Russians during the day were trying to create a picture of starting the greatest offensive operation. And of course, I believe that if that was true, of course, I believe that the President of the United States of America would change his plan. But as you can see, for now, there are no updates about Orekhov and no updates about Kursk. So very difficult to understand whether those pieces of information were true or not. So now let's start about the front lines, and first let's start about the Kupiansk front line. The Russian Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours clashes, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles, including 1 tank. So as you can see, there are not much heavy clashes there, but as you can see, the Ukrainians lost 1 tank. At least this information was confirmed by the Ministry of Defense. When talking about the situation on the ground, there were no changes during the previous 24 hours. Now let's move to the Liman front line. As you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. The Russian Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems, D-30 howitzer and another Raider ANT-PQ-37. And the Ukrainians haven't lost even a single tank on this front line. Furthermore, when talking about Siversk, the Russians published about some kind of progress in the vicinity of Bilogorovka. This is a very interesting region. After the Lysychansk operation, the Russians established control over Bilogorovka and they got as close as possible to Grigorievka and so on. But later, the Ukrainians, during their counter-offensive operation in the direction of Kremenaya, forced the Russians to step back. Then we got some updates that the Russians returned back control. Then we saw some kind of information from the Ukrainians that was a speculation and so on. So this town is very interesting, and to tell the truth, it's very difficult to analyze and to understand whether this information was true or that was another speculation with the pieces of information about crossing the border and offensive operation in Orekhov. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. There are a lot of very interesting updates from Bakhmut, and this morning also started with the piece of information that the Russians managed to encircle Berkhovka, this small town that located on the northwest of Bakhmut, this town. That this morning the Russians reported about some kind of tactical encirclement. The thing is that let's return back to the Western sources map and let's try to understand what did happen in Berkhovka and in the north of Bakhmut. After the Russians established control over Paraskovievka, they started offensive operation in direction of Berkhovka and Dubovo, Vasilievka and Yagidne, as we discussed during my previous 2 videos. This map is not updated, and according to the Russian sources, if you remember, during the clashes for Paraskovievka, the Russians managed to establish control over the north part of this, let's say, railroad Stupki block over this area, over the north part. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians started development their offensive operation along the railroad in this direction. And as a result of that attack, the Russians were moving along these brushes, along this forest line, along this railroad. And as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to cut the supply road between Berkhovka and Yagidne. So Berkhovka was cut off from Bakhmut, from the south and from the east. Furthermore, if you remember, the Russians reported that during the previous few days they managed to cross this road and they established control over the bridgehead and they started storming Berkhovka from the north. So they got as close as possible to this town. Let's update this map just to understand the situation before this morning. So the Russians were somewhere here. So as you can see, according to this configuration of the front line, the Russians were able to establish physical, even fire and physical control over the road that connects Dubovo, Vasilievka and Berkhovka. And the Ukrainians were using Dubovo, Vasilievka as the place, as the bridgehead to supply support for rotation process, and that was the key region that connected the Ukrainians on the north with the mainland, let's say. So as you can see, according to the situation, the Russians managed to cut the road, the north road and the south road. So this is the reason why the Russians this morning published information that Berkhovka was encircled. There was just left just one road, this one local road that goes along the river, then along the water reservoir and so on, but that road was with a very low quality, and as you can see, that was the only road, and it was just a matter of time when the Russians from the south are able to develop their offensive operation along the railroad further to the west, and they will be able to cut this road. Later, somewhere at noon time, maybe in the afternoon time, the Russians reported that they managed to establish control over Berkhovka, and that there were clashes, and that the clashes started in the vicinity or inside Yahidne, inside this town. So let's update this map according to this final information. So according to the Russians, but somewhere in the middle of this day, they managed to establish control over Berkhovka, over this area. Furthermore, the Russians reported that they managed to develop their offensive operation to the south in Stupki Block, and that they managed to establish control over the railroad station Stupki that located very far to the south. But there were no updates about the further progress and so on. So let's update this area as well. So the Russians moved to the south, and they believe that they got control over the railroad station. Let's assume that they stopped somewhere in the middle along this road. So this is the progress in Stupki. And furthermore, don't forget that by this evening the Russians reported that they started clashes in Yahidne itself. So I believe that this is the real situation, and this is the real progress of the Russians during the previous 24 hours. And this is very important. So first of all, let's update this map with colors for better understanding of the situation. So the areas that are under Russian control, and 3 blocks on the north of Bakhmut as well. Just a second. So this is the current situation according to the Russians, to the Russian sources. They established control over Berkhovka, over the north part of Stupki Block, and they entered Yahidne. So as we discussed, from now on we can say that Bakhmut is encircled. At least it's 100% operational encirclement of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are no longer able to support this town from the north. I believe it is very difficult to support this town from the south because the fact that this bridge is destroyed. The only road that Ukrainians have is the road through this town on the near Chasov Yar and in direction of Kramova. This is the only road that Ukrainians have these days. Tomorrow, as we know, there is a very important speech of the President of Russian Federation, Putin, and as I understand, he gave an order to the Ministry of Defense and to Wagner's to, I don't think that the Russians are able to take control of Bakhmut, but I believe that their order is to establish tactical encirclement of Bakhmut. And to do the tactical encirclement, to complete the tactical encirclement, the Russians need to continue movements along the railroad and to get at least somewhere here. So if the Russians are able to get here, then they will be able to establish tactical encirclement of Bakhmut. I believe that within the next 24 hours, the Russians will be able to complete clearing of Yahidne, and maybe the Russians will be able to proceed and develop their offensive operation in Stupki Block to the south, and they will establish their bridgehead along the river, along this small river, as you can see, this one that goes on the south of Stupki and Yahidne. And this is going to be a critical situation for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, I believe that the Russians are able to take control over Dubovo-Vasilievka within the next 24 or 48 hours. So the Russians will try to achieve as much as possible before the speech of President of Russian Federation, Putin. I believe he's going to talk a lot. He's going to tell us a lot of important things about the status of special military operation, about an allies, about using weapon, about chemical weapon that Ukrainians were using during the previous years, about the nuclear weapon, about the dirty nuclear bomb, about the possible supply of Ukraine with some nuclear polluted things and so on. So a lot of things he's going to discuss, and maybe after that the Russians are going to start their greatest offensive operation. Very difficult to understand. I will follow this speech tomorrow 100%. I want to understand what is he going to do, and first of all, it is very important to understand what is going on in his mind and to read everything underlines. Furthermore, don't forget that more and more updates are coming from Zaporozhye, because more and more Wagners are redeployed, are being redeployed in this area these days, these hours, and so on. This is very important. When talking about Donetsk, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 115 soldiers, around 6 armored vehicles, 4 artillery systems, 2 Grad, 1 D-30 howitzer, another anti-tank Rapira system, and 1 radar INT-PQ-36. The Ukrainians haven't lost a single tank in this area. Now let's move to Avdiivka, and today the Russians published a very interesting piece of information about Avdiivka. That was very interesting. As you know, the Russians concentrated a very powerful army along the front line, starting at Zaporozhye and ending at Bakhmut, and during the previous 24 hours, the Russians started testing their modern weapon they have in Avdiivka and in the vicinity of Avdiivka. First of all, the Russians used a lot their 152 corrected or targeted shell that are able to fix and change its direction during its attack. And furthermore, the Russians, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, since the beginning of maybe 2014, the Russian used their aircraft bombs FAB-500. And there is just one question, whether that was attack of aircraft that was flying above Avdiivka, or the Russians used for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation their corrected bombs FAB-500. As you know, the Western countries, the NATO, they have a lot of corrected bombs, navigated bombs that they are able to send, and they will be able to fly around 150 kilometers, and then they will explode somewhere very far from the aircraft. But when talking about the Russians, they have this technology, but they didn't invest a lot in this technology. So, but they started investing and starting developing this technology during this special military operation. I believe that they have some test examples and so on, but they didn't have some kind of industrial potential to build such bombs. And today, the Russians, for the first time, used this corrected aircraft bombs FAB-500. As a result of that attack, there was a lot of this attack dealt a lot of damage to Avdiivka. I believe that within the next few days, maybe we're gonna receive more information about this situation. But for now, and this is very important, because as you know, the Western sources and the Russians confirms that the Russians managed to collect very powerful air forces along the border with Ukraine. More than 500 air carriers, around more than 200 or 300 of helicopters, and all this big air army is waiting for just an order to start greatest offensive operation or something like this. When talking about Zaporozhye area, the Russians reported that during the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, including 1 tank. I believe that, and 2 artillery systems, D-20 howitzer and D-30 howitzer. So during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost up to 2 tanks, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost 3 ammo depot in the vicinity of Vuhledar and in the vicinity of Zaporozhye. As you can see, one more time, according to the Russian sources, this morning the Russians started offensive operation in direction Novodanilovka. I believe that they were trying to eat and to short the gray line, the gray zone between Ukrainian positions and their positions, and this information also shows us and tell us that maybe within the next few days the Russians are going to start their greatest offensive operation in Zaporozhye area as well. If we take a look at Kherson, you're gonna see that there are also some icons in this area. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours of artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost 6 artillery systems, 1 Akatse, 1 Gyatsint, 1 Gvozdika howitzers, another 3 D-30 howitzers as well. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost 1 ammo depot in this area. So that's it about the situation on the ground. One more time, the Russians eat or short the gray zone in Zaporozhye area. The Russians started using their modern weapon to attack Avdiivka. The Russians have encircled or complete the 100% operational encirclement of Bakhmut, and I believe that by the tomorrow's speech of the President of Russian Federation, they will announce about establishing tactical encirclement of Bakhmut. There are no changes in Seversk, just small movements in Bilogorovka. When talking about Liman and Kupinsk front lines, there are no changes on the ground, just the heavy clashes all over the front line. Furthermore, the Russians reported about some crossing of the border in Kharkiv area, and when talking about Sumy, situation hasn't been changed. The situation hasn't been changed since the previous 24 hours. The Ukrainians continue attacking the Russians along the border and along the Kursk region. So maybe possibly the Ukrainians are attacking the Russian accumulation of their forces. And Joe Biden visited Kyiv today in the morning, and he promised a lot of money, a lot of weapon, and so on. And one more time, as we discussed yesterday, I don't know who is going to win this year, but there a lot of Ukrainians are going to die. And that's it for today. Military Summary channels remind you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.